Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we're going to be covering all things disinformation, unpacking the latest trends, and we're also going to be talking about the relationship between disinformation and how possibly its source, its origin, is the decline in local and regional journalism. Talking us through these topics is Theodora Skeadas, and she recently left Twitter's public policy team, previously held consulting positions at Booz Allen Hamilton, and is now a consultant to civil society organizations in the position of working and combating against disinformation. Let's start the show. Hey Theodora, how you doing?
Hi, Rafi. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your show.
Great to have you on. We're really pleased that you're on. So I gave a little short intro about you, but what we like to do every single podcast is kick off with the same question, which was, what was your first ever social media account?
Sure. I wonder what most folks respond with. My first social media account was created early on in high school and was MySpace, so the precursor to Facebook. And I specifically remember the angst that came from having to pick my top 10 friends to display on the right hand side of the screen. It was so stressful. I have two sisters and I have more than eight other friends. And so thinking through both who my top friends were and how to position them hierarchically within that banner was very challenging and very stressful. I lost a lot of sleep over that. So that was my first social media account, but it was also really nice to chat with friends
Amazing,
using
amazing.
it.
The source of many arguments and fallouts
Yes.
of friends, I'm sure. Fantastic, great. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk through. Earlier we were discussing so many different aspects of disinformation that you've been working in from all different angles. So I'd love just you to briefly talk through the kind of experience you've had. What was your first introduction to disinformation in a professional capacity, and what has that looked like over the years?
Yeah. So earlier on in my career, I spent a few years working in the Middle East and North Africa region. And while I was there, I saw the proliferation of social media and how it was used by individuals to advance incredible civil society agendas and have difficult political and social conversations. But I also saw how unhealthy and harmful and incorrect narratives around very sensitive issues like refugee integration and immigration and youth violence proliferated as well over social media. I then spent 5 years consulting to the US federal government, looking at issues around public sentiment, social movements, and disinformation explicitly for the US federal government around the regions of the Middle East, North Africa, as well as Eastern Europe. So, the precursor to and surrounding Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, and then also the Sahel region of Africa. And then more recently, I spent 2 years working at Twitter on a range of projects and issues, including disinformation. And I was part of the team that built out something called the Twitter Moderation Research Consortium, which was intended to share takedown data on state backed information operations with researchers. So, this was specifically data that had violated our platform manipulation policies, led by state actors with independent researchers. So it was a data sharing initiative and was initially planned to share data around all themes of disinformation. So that's been a bit of my experience on this issue.
Amazing. You're like a multi-angled camera that is focused on the topic of disinformation in the private sector, in the public sector, in the platforms themselves. Does that allow you to have a different, better, fresher perspective on the challenge that's being tackled?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, for example, when I started my work at Buzalin, so in a private company, but working for the government, one of the big issues at that time, so this was 2015, 2016, was how the Islamic State was using social media to disseminate its own messaging and recruit individuals to participate in its operations. And I think having just come from work in Turkey and I did some research in Kurdish Iraq as well, so the northeastern part of Iraq, I had some better on the ground experiences. I was working directly with very vulnerable populations, including refugees and immigrants. And so it gave me a better understanding of the on the ground conditions that might induce people to make these kinds of decisions. Financially and professionally. And so having on the ground experiences informed my understanding of the work I was doing for the government, the research that I was doing. And then, of course, being at Twitter allowed me to see issues at an even more macro level and the challenges that these social media platforms face in tackling disinformation.
And so I think another aspect of your experience has been the fact that you've had that direct in different geographies around the world. And I think sometimes the conversation, in Western countries can be quite focused in a very specific way, the way that we engage with social media platforms, what we're exposed to. But actually it's felt, it's lived, experienced in different ways in different parts of the world. What have you been your experiences around that?
Yeah. So you mean specifically like how misinformation or disinformation proliferates and is received by different audiences based on their geographic positioning?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, part of it is, of course, a function of sympathies and pre existing geopolitical alliances
Hmm.
because so, and of course, it's important to start by distinguishing mis and disinformation. Generally, misinformation is considered to be the sharing of inaccurate information without some kind of political or social agenda. And
Hmm.
then disinformation is when that becomes weaponized by actors, often state actors or coordinated political actors for a certain political or social outcome. And I think that the kinds of narratives that proliferate are based on the underlying beliefs of the geographic place. And
Hmm.
so different narratives proliferate based on where they're arising. For example, in the context of the war between Russia and Ukraine, um, the narratives that are spreading in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe are a little bit different from the ones that are spreading in different parts of the Middle East or Africa or China or other regions. And so, really, it's a function of how countries and how people are already geopolitically aligned. In combination with global events that take place on top of that. So it's very much localized to specific geographies.
Amazing. And I'm sure for so many people listening that they're going to be interested in hearing about some of the work that you did on at Twitter and the public policy team. Maybe talk us through some of the, I suppose, challenges, but also as well, there's some of the successes that you had.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'll talk about the Twitter Moderation Research Consortium just because it was a really cutting edge data sharing initiative with independent researchers that, when it launched late last summer into September, was received very well by the community. So it was definitely a success in its launch. We had launched it initially with three partners of ours: Stanford Internet Observatory, so based in North America, Cazadores de Fake News, which is Latin American focused, and ASPI, which is a think tank based in Australia, so covering the Asian region. And we were able to pilot the program with these three partners and publish through their research with the data that we shared really interesting coverage. So I'll just highlight one as an example, but I can talk through a few. The Stanford Internet Observatory published a piece called Unheard Voice. Um, it was pretty cutting edge. This was late August of 2022, and it was specifically about accounts that had been taken down by Twitter of US government. So we didn't actually attribute any of this to governments for a whole bunch of reasons, but but people could deduce based on the coverage that that was done where the information was coming from. And so ultimately, there was subsequent New York Times coverage of this issue. Um, the article that was published talked about how Twitter and others like Facebook removed pro US influence campaigns for the first time ever. So it had been discovered that that stakeholders were promoting US interests abroad, specifically in regions like the Middle East and North Africa.
Mm,
And ultimately, the coverage of the New York Times and of others resulted in subsequent decisions by the Pentagon to order a review of its overseas social media campaigns. So it was really interesting to see this connection between stakeholders, where it was stakeholders that were working on Twitter's platform. It was the private company that then shared the data with independent researchers at academic institutions that published that data, that was then highlighted by journalistic organizations like the New York Times, that resulted in public sector changes at the Pentagon. Um, and so you can see how all of these stakeholders are really connected, which I think is an important theme. Everything is connected. So that's an example of a success through the program. Other pieces of research covered efforts to foment social unrest, specifically looking at ethnic
mm,
minorities in
mm,
places like South and Southeast Asia, which are already very diverse
mhm,
regions, as well as efforts to spread narratives by countries like Russia and China in advance of the US 2022 midterm elections, and then efforts to undermine trust in civil society organizations in Central America, in countries like Honduras and Guatemala. So there was a range of reporting that was resultant from this program. I would say a failure, of course, is that the program isn't operating anymore. And
mm.
that's because of recent changes at the company. So that's a disappointment to many of us.
So maybe let's take the opportunity to zoom out a bit because I don't always have the chance to speak to someone who has been so immersed on the front line of fighting disinformation, and so I want to take a step back and maybe sometimes I think about all the conversations that I have with family members, for example, and they sometimes refer to me and say, "Well, I received this link for Bitcoin. It was obvious. Those are fake accounts. That was obvious,
Yeah.
or things that were." To the human eye, kind of quite obvious of, oh, I saw that, obviously that's fake. What would you say to them, or how would you even describe what dis and misinformation is, or the dangers of it, for someone that might not even be aware of what to look out for?
Yeah, so it's funny. I'll actually talk about my nuclear family in this because my family is very diverse. So in my nuclear family, I have two younger sisters and two parents, and each of us have partners. And my dad is a Trump supporting individual, someone who is MAGA, and feels a lot of sympathy for Donald Trump, and was, in fact, most recently protesting the indictment of Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago in
Mm,
Florida a few weeks ago. So very committed to that cause. I, on the other hand, am on the other end of the spectrum. I lean pretty left, very progressive, and so it's been challenging when I see we use a WhatsApp thread in my family to talk about issues underway,
mhm,
um, and my dad will often put in comments linking to articles that he's seeing that are sometimes on Fox News and sometimes even on Newsmax and OAN, One American Network, I think it stands for, a
mhm,
right leaning news source. And often it's not true, the coverage that he's sharing. And so I encourage him and others. I see it often on Facebook as well. I have very conservative friends from my childhood, and I see what they post on social media, and I'll sometimes ping them privately and I'll say, "Hey, this is not true. You
mhm,
might want to consider taking this down or adding a comment that says that this is false and that a mistake was made."
mhm,
Very often, generally, they think it's true, but they're not fact checking, they're not double checking the news coverage or cross referencing it with other news sources. And so the best thing to do when one is uncertain of accuracy is to cross-reference it with an additional news source, ideally a news source that has a different political leaning, because that can most quickly verify or present an alternate narrative, certainly. But cross-checking information with other sources, and there are fact-checking websites that one can go to as well, can be really helpful. I think the challenge is that generally these people are already so committed to this
Mm,
worldview
mm,
that um, that it doesn't even occur to them that the information could be false. So it doesn't then occur to them that they should be checking because they've already bought into the narrative,
mhm.
and so it takes generally an outside person, someone they trust, so a family member or a trusted friend, to suggest to them that they might want to revisit the news.
Right.
And there are other ways too. So, for example, um, Twitter has tried different kinds of nudges, different ways to get folks to think about the truth of what they're reading. So, for example, if they're going to repost an article that they haven't read, a
Mhm,
prompt shows up and says,
mhm,
"Hey, wait a second. Do you really want to post this? If you haven't even opened the link, like you haven't even clicked on the article,
mm,
are you sure you're ready to amplify this news if you haven't even engaged with the content?" And so nudges like that can be very effective
mhm.
in getting folks to think a little more carefully about the information they're sharing.
I suppose, like everything, the solution is multifaceted. It's not one silver bullet. But when you said the word nudges, I'm kind of interested in digging a little bit deeper in that. What are other examples of kind of the nudges? I don't. We can talk about it
Yeah.
from the social media platform side, but also things that regulators should be thinking about, or how does that work? I think that's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, I can go from both angles. So on there, every stakeholder has a role to play in creating a safer information environment. And so every stakeholder has different interventions that they can try. So from the platform side, I'll start there, but then can talk about governments too. There are different nudges that companies like Twitter have tried to help people make healthier choices.
Hmm.
And this isn't limited to disinformation. Can also include content safety and abuse mitigation. So
Hmm.
things like mention controls, so which is the ability to remove oneself from a tweet that one doesn't want to be associated with,
Hmm.
or reply prompts, which encourage people to pause and reconsider a potentially harmful or offensive reply before tweeting,
Hmm.
or safety mode, a mode that detects and blocks potentially abusive or spammy accounts.
Hmm.
These are examples of features that a platform can roll out. And then, of course, there are also policies. So, Twitter, for example, has had several policies that look to combat misinformation.
Hmm.
So, this includes, for example, crisis misinformation, COVID misinformation,
Hmm.
synthetic and manipulated media, and civic integrity.
Hmm.
So, the first one, the crisis misinformation policy, looks to create a safer information environment during times of crisis. This policy was put into effect to look at all kinds of different kinds of crises. So not just interstate war, but also, for example, natural disasters.
Hmm.
Um, and then the COVID misinformation policy was created to stem the flow of misinformation around COVID, right? So vaccines and CDC or other like health body disseminated information. It's looking to elevate authentic and credible narratives on healthcare so that people can access accurate health information. And then the synthetic and manipulated media policy, that's the one I referenced earlier in the context of the Twitter Moderation Research Consortium,
Hmm.
is intended to um, reduce and combat the sharing of synthetic, manipulated, or out of context media that can deceive and confuse people and lead to harm, aka misleading media. And the last one, civic integrity, is specifically used during times of civic processes. So these can include elections, of course,
Hmm.
but also census events or major referenda or ballot initiatives, and is intended to combat misleading information about processes and procedures around participating in civic events, so that folks can engage authentically in civic processes. So these are examples of policies that companies have used to curate healthier information spaces. In terms of efforts that governments can take, so there's a whole range of efforts that governments can do to create safer information spaces. So, for example, governments we're seeing increasingly are building out teams and launching websites that are encouraging people to learn more about how to view online material in
Hmm.
a healthy and safe way.
The
They're also
education piece.
Yep, education is a really, really important role that governments can play
Hmm.
in educate, yeah, in helping people understand the tools that are at their disposal and how they can be informed consumers online. So education is one. There's also technical assistance. So governments are offering technical assistance often through funding. So investing in civil society organizations that are combating disinformation, and building out civil society actors to do education and other kinds of interventions. Um, those are some ways that governments are involved. There's also regulation. So, this is on the lawmaker side, less on the administration side, but there are increasingly conversations around transparency and data sharing.
Hmm.
So, for example, the new Digital Services Act and the new Digital Markets Act, implemented by the European Union, are increasing thresholds around transparency. So, requiring folks, rather, companies to do better and more transparency reporting, so that consumers are more informed on issues like this.
And one of the kind of key stakeholders in this whole conversation is media journalism. And I know one of the things that you wanted to raise, one of the points that you wanted to raise today, was about when it comes to disinformation, but is also maybe taking a step back, but looking at the kind of historical, looking at the changes that we've seen in local and regional journalism, and actually how you have a strong opinion or had a thought about how that is actually having a bigger impact on everything.
Yeah, so I'll take a step back and then I'll dive into that issue specifically. So, PEN America recently published a report called Hard News: Journalists and the Threat of Disinformation. They did a survey of more than 1,000 reporters and editors on how disinformation is disrupting the practice of journalism. And they find that in aggregate, journalists are really struggling with disinformation for a few reasons. One is that they have to spend a lot more time doing fact checking. It just
Mm,
takes a lot more time for them to do their investigatory work. And it also creates an atmosphere of distrust, which leads to a huge backlash against journalists, including threatening emails, phone calls, and letters, and sometimes even in person harassment, doxing, trolling, catfishing, and all kinds of concerns around personal safety that journalists experience because of this heightened atmosphere of distrust, which is a function of increasing disinformation.
mm,
So I think there's this broader understanding of the role of disinformation in journalism. These are some of the findings of the report, but certainly it's creating bigger challenges in the context of free expression and press freedom. And then to the specific suggestion that you had. So there was recently an interesting and very provocative opinion piece in the New York Times, called Disinformation is Not the Real Problem with Democracy. And the author suggests that while there's a huge conversation around disinformation, and right now that's the conversation we're participating in, he suggests that the bigger challenge to democracy is actually the decline of independent journalism. And that
mm,
what we've seen over the last several years is a real decline in independent news outlets. There's been, in general, a decline in independent institutions around the
mhm,
United States. We've seen a decline in local and independent businesses, and independent institutions of all stripes. And so, this person's suggestion is that the lack of localized and regional news sources, vis a vis the numbers in the past, means that there is less coverage of local issues,
mhm,
and less authentic and locally based coverage.
mhm,
And so the real issue that he takes here, the real threat to democracy, is the lack of information that people have that enables them to participate in political processes and in their social circumstances. And that really, and I think this is a really compelling argument, the idea um, that localized journalism is the solution to democracy because it empowers people to participate in the political process, and that we're seeing a decline in political participation, not because of disinformation, but rather because of a decline of local journalism.
That's super interesting, and I also think, I mean, you spoke about it in a wider context, but I think also on a very just basic level, it means that there are more people. If there were more journalists, more local region journalists, there would just be more professionals who have the skills to be able to, like you said, check facts, go through the story, go through that rigorous process of making sure. And in the absence of that, I think it leaves that to individuals. And I'm not sure most individuals are as skilled or professional or have the time necessarily to do that.
Definitely don't. I'll give an example just to substantiate this. So, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you would think that Cambridge, which is a really vibrant society, um, would have great local journalism. But the reality is that we too have seen an incredible decline in local journalism over the last several years. And now the only outfit that covers Cambridge, which is a city of about 110,000 people, is the Cambridge Day, run by one person who mostly volunteers his time. I mean, he does incredible coverage. His name is Mark. And he's just so thorough and comprehensive. But he recently had to launch a crowdfunding campaign just this
Mm,
week.
wow.
He created an advisory board to try to revitalize and grow and sustain the organization because he doesn't have the resources to keep it going.
Wow.
And so he's now trying to raise, I think, $75,000 to keep the Cambridge Day alive in the year to come. And if he doesn't raise those funds, we might not have any local journalism in Cambridge anymore. Um, it's very disheartening.
And then we would all be poorer for it.
Yeah.
We're approaching the half an hour mark. And so I also want to give you an opportunity. A question we ask all guests that come on the show is to tell us something pretty short and sweet. One thing good, one thing bad, and one thing fake that you're seeing in the online space right now.
Yeah, so those are great questions. I think in terms of the good, there's a real concerted effort to break down silos and work together. In
Hmm.
fact, one of the consultancies that I'm supporting now with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, their Partnership for Countering Influence Operations, is specifically looking at this issue. So trying to think about where stakeholders across sectors, so that means academia, civil society, or nonprofits, the for profit companies, the platforms themselves, governments, and intergovernmental organizations can be in better communication with each other so that we're not duplicating efforts, creating redundancy, and working past each other. And so they're doing a whole bunch of initiatives like working groups and research studies and other efforts to think about um, how we can be more effective in tackling these issues.
Hmm.
In terms of the bad, I'll give a two-pronged approach here. So, Freedom House publishes an um, annual report that looks at freedom online, freedom on the net. And in their last report, they found increasing authoritarianism globally. Um,
Hmm.
and and other organizations like Access Now look at this issue too, looking at increasing threats to digital access, which is really a fundamental right so that people can raise their voices and engage in important and divisive and challenging political and social conversations. And so we're
Mm.
seeing this surge in government efforts to undermine that access around the world. And that's very troubling. And then I think at the same time, um, for example, the real really challenging layoffs that this technology sector is experiencing now is resulting in the layoffs of people who are the very people doing this work, people like myself, who were doing the work of tackling disinformation online.
Mm.
And it's reducing resources at the very time when we most need to be investing in those resources and those efforts. and in terms of the fake news, so I'll return to my family for this answer. So, as I mentioned earlier, or maybe alluded to, my family is Greek Orthodox, and I grew up in a very conservative family context in New York, a little about an hour north of New York City. And I often see commentary on my news feeds that I know are not real. So I'll give one example of a narrative that I try to push back on when I see it. There's a narrative that I think is very harmful, that um, Muslim communities in the Middle East are actively undermining and targeting Christian minority populations in the
Hmm.
Middle East. This is something that my family participates in, or rather, the community that I'm a part of, I see participating in part because there are Greek Orthodox Christian communities in the Middle East, in places like Palestine. And so there's a real natural affinity for those communities, and that's a good thing to have those affinities. But I see this narrative that these more populist groups, so Muslim communities, are actively targeting the Christian minorities, and that's one that is just not true. And so when I see that, I make a point of reaching out to those individuals. Often I'll see coverage that's like 7 years old. They'll be using images that are out of date, or the headers don't necessarily connect to the images, or there are different discrepancies that I observe. And I just point those out to say, hey, this coverage doesn't really add up. It's using information that's now 10 years old, or it's extrapolating from one singular incident to draw a larger narrative that just isn't real. So that's an example of fake news that actually connects to my life, and research that I've done, and content that I see even now online.
Amazing. Thank you, Theodora. Thank you so much for coming onto the pod and sharing all those thoughts. Really, really fascinating, really interesting. We'll include, you mentioned quite a few different links and articles and reports.
So I'll share them with you.
We'll try and include as many of those links as possible in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.